In the dense, unforgiving jungles of Vietnam, a lone U.S. Army Ranger moved with calculated precision, his every step swallowed by the thick foliage. What started as a routine patrol took a shocking turn when he came face to face with a pair of gleaming amber eyes watching from the darkness. Sergeant Daniel Reeves wasn't your typical soldier. For over a decade, he had honed his skills in the wild, tracking, surviving, and striking without warning. Raised in the Appalachian backwoods, before becoming one of the Army's most feared operatives, he was known for his uncanny ability to read the land and what lurked within it. When he encountered the Bengal tiger crouched low in the undergrowth, its muscles coiled like steel springs, he had no idea he was stepping into a different kind of war. The Vietnamese thought the jungle was their greatest weapon, but they hadn't accounted for a predator more patient, more relentless, and just as deadly. Reeves didn't just survive that night. He adapted, using the beast instincts to rewrite the rules of engagement. What began as a soldier navigating enemy terrain became something far more primal. The jungle had its rulers, and Reeves was about to prove that not all of them walked on four legs. The battlefield, and those who stalked it, would never be the same after that night. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The overhead fan spun lazily, doing little, to cut through the thick, humid air inside the command center. Dim yellow light pooled over the scarred wooden table where Captain Thomas Hayes studied a series of reconnaissance photos. His eyes flicked from image to image, tracing the crude supply routes carved through the jungle, the shapes of bunkers, hidden beneath thick foliage, the barely perceptible paths worn into the underbrush by men who knew the land better than any satellite ever could. "This is Min's territory," Colonel Grayson said, his voice rough from years of barking orders and chain-smoking unfiltered cigarettes. "He's a ghost, Hayes. Every team we've sent in, gone." Hayes didn't look up. He'd read the reports. 10-man squads vanishing without a trace. Radio signals cutting out mid-transmission. No bodies found, just gear left behind, neatly arranged, as if mocking the men who had once carried it. "This is different," Grayson continued, lighting another cigarette. "You're different. Your team doesn't blunder through the jungle like regular infantry. You see things. You read the land. That's why you're going in." Hayes nodded slightly but said nothing. He'd been handpicked for missions like this before, missions that others had failed. He knew the stakes. He also knew that in war, skill only carried a man so far. Luck, as unreliable as it was, played its part. "The objective?" Hayes asked, finally looking up. "Intel. Min's supply lines are damn near invisible. Our boys keep getting ambushed with no warning. You find out how he's moving his people and weapons, you bring that intel back." Grayson exhaled, the smoke curling in the stagnant air. "You're not here to fight a war, Captain. You're here to make sure we win it." In the dimly lit barracks, the air carried the scent of gun oil and sweat. Sergeant Sarah Martinez sat, cross-legged on a crate, disassembling a radio with the speed and precision of a surgeon. She barely looked up when Hayes entered. "Tell me we're not walking into another disaster," she said, snapping the last piece back into place. "That depends," Hayes replied. "How good are you at making radios work through 50 miles of jungle and rock?" She smirked. "Better than you." Across the room, Private Michael Chen adjusted the strap on his pack, trying and failing to look as confident as the others. He'd barely been in country a month. He was smart, a quick study with electronics, but he wasn't battle-tested. "Not yet. You're going to want to pack lighter," Hayes told him. "You carry too much, and the jungle will eat you alive before the enemy ever gets the chance." Chen nodded, adjusting his gear again, trying to look like he belonged. "5-man team," Martinez said, standing. "That's it?" "That's it," Hayes confirmed. "Small footprint, less noise." She exhaled through her nose. "So we're ghosts." Hayes nodded. "We have to be." Miles away, in a dim underground chamber beneath a thatched roof hut, Nguyen Van Minh studied, a hand-drawn map of the valley. His advisor, Tran Duc, stood beside him, his lined face unreadable. "They will come soon," Tran Duc murmured. "Another team." Min nodded. He had already anticipated it. The Americans were relentless, like the rivers during the monsoon, always pushing, always trying to find a way through. But the jungle belonged to Min. He had walked its paths since childhood, long before he had ever held a rifle. The land spoke to him in ways the Americans would never understand. "They will come," Min said, his voice calm, almost gentle. "And, when they do, we will show them that they do not belong." He reached out, running his fingers over the map, over the places where his traps lay hidden, where his men moved unseen, where the land itself would fight alongside them. Tran Duc hesitated. This new leader, Hayes, he is not like the others. Min smiled faintly. No, he is not. For the first time in a long while, Min felt something close to interest. A mind like Hayes's was a rare thing. It was almost a shame that he would have to break him. Hayes sat alone in his quarters, the map spread out before him, the report stacked high. His fingers traced the ridgelines, the river crossings, the places where men had disappeared. He knew Min was waiting. He could feel it in his bones. Outside, the jungle stretched out in all directions, vast and unknowable. The mission would begin at dawn. Hayes closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the night. Tomorrow, the hunt would begin. The rhythmic thumping of rotor blades cut. Through the early morning mist, the sound dull and distant as the helicopter skimmed just above the jungle canopy. Inside the UH-1 Huey, Captain Thomas Hayes kept his eyes fixed on the dense green below, watching for movement, for any hint that they weren't the only ones awake in this stretch of Vietnam. He adjusted his grip on the frame of the open door, the warm wind whipping past him, carrying the damp scent of earth and foliage. The jungle was alive in ways most men didn't understand, and if they weren't careful, it would swallow them whole. Martina sat across from him, her expression unreadable as she double-checked the squad's radio equipment. Chen sat beside her, gripping his rifle too tightly, the tension in his shoulders betraying the nerves he tried to suppress. Hayes leaned closer, raising his voice over the engine. "Breathe, Private. The jungle can smell fear." Chen forced a stiff nod, but Hayes saw his throat bob as he swallowed hard. He let it go. There was only one way for the kid to learn. 2 minutes, the pilot called back. Hayes gave a final glance at the map strapped to his thigh, then at the horizon. The jungle stretched endlessly in every direction, its depths unknowable from above. Somewhere down there, Min was already watching. The helicopter banked low. It was time. The moment Hayes's boots hit the ground, the world changed. The jungle wrapped around them like a living thing, its heat pressing against his skin, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The roar of the Huey faded as it lifted off, leaving only the sound of insects and distant birdsong. Martinez signaled, and the team fanned out, rifles at the ready, each man moving with practiced precision. Chen took a cautious step forward and immediately stepped on a dry branch. The sharp snap echoed through the underbrush. Hayes's head snapped toward him, his expression unreadable. Chen froze. Even Martinez winced. A mistake, small but telling. Hayes inhaled slowly, crouching as he pressed his palm against the ground, fingers sifting through damp soil. His grandfather's voice echoed in his mind. "The land will always tell you a story, Tommy. You just have to listen." Hayes was 12, deep in the Montana woods, his grandfather kneeling beside him in the snow. The old man had a face like weathered stone, his gray braids tucked beneath a worn Stetson. "What do you see?" his grandfather had asked. Hayes had looked down at the snow, his breath curling in the cold air. He saw tracks, deer maybe. But his grandfather shook his head. "Not what you see. What do you feel?" Hayes furrowed his brow, touching the indentation left behind. The edges were still sharp, untouched by wind. "Fresh," he murmured, "maybe. Half an hour old." His grandfather had nodded approvingly. "Good. Now which way?" Hayes studied the forest, the trees heavy with ice, the silence pressing. Then he noticed it. How the needles of a fir tree were disturbed just slightly, the faintest scrape in the snow leading toward a ridge. He pointed. His grandfather smiled. You're learning. Now crouched in the Vietnamese jungle, Hayes let the moment settle before looking up at Chen. Stop listening to your own footsteps, he murmured. Listen to the jungle instead. Chen nodded stiffly, his cheeks burning. Martinez tapped her earpiece. Got something, she whispered. Hayes turned as she adjusted the dial on her radio. A crackle, then a distant fragmented transmission in Vietnamese. The words were muffled, incomplete, but there was no mistaking it. Someone was talking about them. Miles away, Nguyen Van Minh sat cross-legged beneath a low-hanging canopy of vines, surrounded by his scouts. They were young, some no older than 14, but they moved with the silence of men twice their age. A short, wiry boy named Bao knelt beside him, pressing his fingers into the soil the way Hayes had done moments earlier. They landed, Bao whispered. Not far. Minh nodded, unsurprised. He had already known. The Americans are careful, he murmured. This one. Hayes. He is not like the others. Tran Duc, standing nearby, crossed his arms. Then why let them advance? Min's eyes flickered toward the dense trees beyond. Because they do not know they are already surrounded. Back in the jungle, Hayes signaled for silence. The radio transmission was faint, but it was enough. They weren't alone. He gestured for Martinez to try and trace the source. She nodded, adjusting the radio, brow furrowing in concentration. Chen tightened his grip on his rifle. His breathing was too fast. Hayes placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Easy. Chen exhaled, steadying himself. Martinez's eyes flicked up, meeting Hayes. They're close, she mouthed. Hayes nodded. The jungle stretched around them, vast and quiet. Somewhere in the trees, Min's men were watching, waiting. Hayes looked down at the ground, scanning. The disturbed leaves, the subtle shifts in vegetation. The land will always tell you a story. He studied the earth. Then slowly, he looked up. And for the briefest moment just beyond the edge of the clearing, he swore he saw movement. A shadow, a whisper of motion. Gone. But not before Hayes knew the truth. They were already being hunted. The jungle was never silent, but here the quiet felt unnatural. The team moved in a tight formation, eyes scanning the thick vegetation, ears straining against the oppressive weight of the humidity. Then, Hayes saw it. A wisp of smoke, barely visible against the treetops. He raised a fist and the team froze. Martinez crouched beside him, following his gaze. Campfire, she murmured. Recent, Hayes confirmed. He motioned forward and they moved cautiously, weaving through the underbrush with deliberate steps. They found it minutes later, an abandoned camp, no more than a few hours cold. A ring of stones encircled smoldering ashes, the charred remains of a cooking pot still warm to the touch. A lean-to, hastily disassembled, left nothing but flattened earth where someone had slept. Boot prints littered the soft ground, a mix of sizes, some pressed deeper than others. This wasn't a full unit, Hayes muttered. Scouts, maybe 5 or 6. Martinez scanned the scene, fingers brushing against a half-buried ration tin. But why leave in such a hurry? Hayes exhaled, crouching to press his palm against the ground. The jungle always told a story, and this one, they knew we were coming. In the undergrowth, Nguyen Van Minh watched from a distance. The Americans had found his first gift. Beside him, Tran Duc knelt, studying their movements through a pair of battered field glasses. They are reading the ground, Tran Duc whispered, tracking our direction. Minh gave a faint nod. Good. Hayes was different from the others. He didn't just react, he observed, calculated, listened. But even a skilled hunter could be misled. Min's fingers brushed the fabric of a scarf, tied to a low-hanging branch, a deliberate placement, a whisper of false direction. Just one of many. Let them chase ghosts, Min murmured. By the time they realize, they will already be lost. Back at the camp, Hayes studied the tracks. The trail led west, deeper into the valley. The jungle in that direction was dense, a natural choke point. An ambush waiting to happen. Too obvious. He looked in the opposite direction. The underbrush there was more disturbed, but something felt off. Martinez frowned. If they knew we were coming, why not cover their tracks? Or set traps? Hayes ran his fingers over the soil. Because they want us to follow. A faint breeze stirred the trees, sending loose leaves tumbling across the ground. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice. The best traps don't force a man to step forward. They make him want to. Hayes stood. His gut told him they were walking into something, but the mission came first. We follow, he said. Martinez hesitated. You sure? No, Hayes admitted. But we don't have a choice. Min crouched by the riverbank, his hands steady as he wrapped fresh bandages around a young villager's leg. The boy winced, but did not cry out. Leti Hong sat beside him, her presence a quiet comfort. Your hands are still gentle, Min. She murmured, You have not forgotten how to heal. Min's jaw tightened. But I have not forgotten how to kill either. Her gaze was unreadable. Does one erase the other? He said nothing. The Americans were moving exactly as he had planned. The game was unfolding, but something gnawed at him. A hesitation, a memory. Min's fingers stilled against the bandage as a ghost from the past crept into his mind. Flashes of fire. Screams. The taste of ash in the air. His wife's voice calling for him. His son's hand slipping from his grasp. The village had been peaceful once. A school, a marketplace. The scent of rice and fresh-cut fruit in the morning. He had been a teacher then, not a soldier. Until the bombs came, until the jungle became the only home he had left. A sharp snap in the trees pulled him back to the present. Bao, his youngest scout, stood nearby, his face tense. They are coming. Min exhaled, suppressing the ghosts of the past. Let them. The team moved cautiously, the jungle pressing in on all sides. Chen wiped sweat from his brow. Feels like we're being herded. Hayes glanced at him. The kid had a point. Martinez pointed ahead. Look. A scrap of fabric fluttered from a low branch. A scarf, barely visible against the greenery. Min's, Hayes murmured. It wasn't carelessly left behind. It was placed. A message. A challenge. Martinez's voice was quiet. You think he's watching? Hayes's lips pressed into a thin line. I'd bet my life on it. For the first time, he wasn't sure who was hunting who. And somewhere in the trees, unseen but felt, Min was smiling. The game had truly begun. The first raindrop landed on the brim of Hayes's boonie hat, darkening the fabric before another followed, then another. Within minutes, the drizzle thickened into a steady downpour, the kind that turned jungle trails into thick rivers of mud and muffled even the sharpest of sounds. We need cover, Martinez muttered, tugging her poncho tighter around her radio gear. Storm's gonna drown our comms if we don't get a dry spot soon. Hayes scanned the tree line. The air smelled of wet earth, of wood soaked through. He gestured west. There's something up ahead. Old structures. Move. The team pressed forward through the storm, boots sinking into the mud with every step. The jungle opened into a clearing, revealing the remains of an abandoned village. Half a dozen stilt houses, their thatched roofs sagging with decay. They moved cautiously, rifles at the ready. The village had been empty for some time, but life still clung to it in traces. A rusted bicycle leaned against a collapsed fence, a child's toy half buried in the dirt, a cooking pot overturned, beside a cold fire pit. Chen hesitated near a doorway, staring at faded markings on a wooden beam. Hayes stepped beside him. It's a height chart, Chen murmured. He ran a finger over the carved notches. Kids used to live here. Hayes exhaled. The war had emptied villages like this all over Vietnam, scattering families like dry leaves in the wind. He didn't let himself linger on it. Inside, he ordered, "Get dry." We wait out the storm. Miles away, deep in the earth, Min's men huddled in the narrow tunnels of a hidden cave network, their fire barely a flicker against the damp stone. The rain drummed against the jungle above them, masking movement, making it impossible to track the Americans in real time. Min sat near the entrance, watching as a boy no older than 13 worked through a small book of arithmetic problems by the firelight. "You are supposed to be resting, Bao," Min said. The boy looked up, smiling sheepishly. "I do not want to forget, Commander." Min studied him for a long moment. "You were a student before the war?" Bao nodded. "My father was a teacher." Min glanced toward the cave wall, where water dripped steadily from the ceiling. "So was I." Bao's eyes widened. "You were?" Min allowed himself a faint smile. "Long ago." The boy hesitated. "Do you miss it?" Min exhaled, thinking of chalk dust on his fingers, of laughter echoing in a sunlit classroom. "There are things," he said quietly, "that war cannot take from us." He glanced at Tranduk, who had been listening in silence. The older man met his gaze knowingly. "And there are things it takes forever," Tranduk murmured. Min did not answer. In the abandoned village, Hayes sat near the doorway of the house they had taken shelter in, watching the rain pour in sheets beyond the roof's overhang. His fingers absently traced the wood of his rifle, but his mind was elsewhere. "You can't track a storm, Tommy. You just prepare for it." The words came from long ago, from another storm, another place. He was 17, standing beside his grandfather, on the front porch of their Montana home, watching the black clouds roll in over the pines. "Some storms you see coming," his grandfather had said, rocking in his old chair, his braids tucked beneath a hat. "Some you don't." Hayes had nodded, but his grandfather had turned to him, eyes sharp. "The real question, boy, is do you know what kind of storm you're in?" Now, in this village far from home, Hayes wasn't sure. Martinez's voice pulled him, back to the present. "Got something," she murmured, adjusting the radio's frequency. "Intercepted a signal. Low power. Civilians requesting aid." Hayes frowned. "Where?" "Northwest. Not far." Hayes glanced at the rain. Moving in this weather would be slow, but if people needed help, Chen shifted. "What if it's a trap?" Hayes sighed. The kid was thinking like a soldier now. "Maybe," he admitted. "Or maybe it's just people caught between two armies." Lei Hong moved quickly, her hand steady despite the dim candlelight. The man lying on the woven mat groaned as she tightened the bandage around his arm. His wound was shallow, he'd live, but the same could not be said for all of them. Around her, villagers huddled together, waiting out the storm. Some were local farmers, displaced by fighting. Others were soldiers, Viet Cong fighters too, injured to keep moving. She treated them all. A faint rustling at the door made her look up. A woman, her clothes soaked, stepped inside, carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a set of American dog tags. Lei Hong's breath caught. The soldier attached to them had been brought in the night before, too injured to speak. But now, there was no need. She knew who the Americans were hunting, and she knew they were closer than they thought. The rain continued to fall, soaking the jungle, washing away footprints, blurring the lines between friend and enemy. In the abandoned village, Hayes stared at the height chart on the doorframe, thinking of all the lives that had once filled these homes. In the cave, Min watched as Bao turned another page in his book, the numbers and equations stark against the flickering light. Two men on opposite sides of a war listening to the same storm, and knowing that when it passed, the hunt would begin again. The jungle thinned as they neared the village, the dense canopy giving way to the scattered silhouettes of stilt houses. Hayes slowed his pace, raising a closed fist. The team halted. Martinez scanned the perimeter through her scope. "Looks quiet," she murmured. Chen shifted beside her. "Too quiet?" "Always," she muttered. Hayes studied the scene. Smoke curled lazily from a few cooking fires. Children darted between houses, their laughter distant, cautious. A handful of older villagers worked the fields near the tree line, keeping their heads down. A place like this didn't survive in a war zone by accident. "Martinez, you're up," Hayes said. She nodded, slinging her rifle and stepping forward, her stance loose, her hands open. She was better at this than any of them. Reading people, knowing when to press, when to back off. They moved in slowly, rifles lowered but ready. No one ran, no one screamed. A bad sign. It meant the villagers had seen men like them before. A woman emerged from one of the huts, her posture straight, her eyes unwavering. Older, but strong. She wasn't afraid. Hayes recognized the look, immediately. Someone who had survived by knowing exactly how to balance on the knife's edge between warring sides. Viet Cong. Min crouched in the brush 100 meters away, watching the Americans enter the village. His scouts were already in position, unseen but close, rifles trained on the intruders. Min wasn't here to fight. Yet. Hayes moved with careful authority. He wasn't forcing control over the space, but he wasn't naive either. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Min respected that. Beside him, Bao tensed. Should we stop them? Min shook his head. Not yet, because this was a different battlefield, and the most dangerous weapons here weren't guns. They were words. Inside the village, Viet Cong moved with the ease of someone who had lived 100 lifetimes in this war. "You walk like men expecting trouble," she said, her voice even, her accent sharp but deliberate. "Should I be worried?" Hayes studied her. "You run this village?" he asked. She let out a dry chuckle. "No one runs a village anymore, Captain, but I keep people alive." Martinez stepped in. "We're just passing through, but we could use some information." Viet Cong's gaze flickered over them. Then she gestured toward a small wooden bench under an awning. "Sit. You drip like dying trees." Hayes hesitated before lowering himself onto the bench. The rest of the team remained standing. "Who are you looking for?" she asked. Hayes didn't answer. Viet Cong smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Not many secrets here," she continued. "Only people trying to survive." Her gaze moved to Chen, who stood near the edge of the group, favoring his left leg slightly. "You limp," she noted. "Show me." Chen stiffened. "I'm fine." Viet Cong shot him a look that could have peeled bark from a tree. "No soldier is fine." "Sit." Chen hesitated. "That wasn't a request," she said. Martinez nudged him. "Go." With reluctance, Chen sat. Viet Cong knelt, rolling up his pant leg. A bruise was already forming on his calf from an earlier stumble in the jungle. "This is nothing," she muttered, reaching for a cloth and dabbing at the scrape. "You Americans act like wounds make you weak." She glanced up at Hayes. "You think blood is the only thing war takes from a man?" Hayes held her gaze but said nothing. Viet Cong sighed. "What is it you really want, Captain?" From the tree line, Min watched the interaction unfold. His fingers tightening around the strap of his rifle. Viet Cong had treated his men before. She was not loyal to either side, only to survival. That made her valuable and dangerous. Tran Duc crouched beside him. "She knows something." Min nodded. "She always does. But what would she say?" Hayes exhaled. "We're looking for movement, supply routes. We know this region is active." Viet Cong wiped her hands clean. "War moves, like a river, Captain, always changing." Hayes leaned forward slightly. "Where does it flow now?" For the first time, something flickered in her expression. A calculation, a choice. Then she stood. "Come with me." She led them through the village, past the cooking fires, past the wary stares of onlookers. The air smelled of wet wood and rice, of distant smoke. Near the back of the village, behind an old storage shed, she stopped. She pointed to the ground. "What do you see?" Hayes crouched. At first it was just dirt, but then tracks. Not just any tracks. Repeating patterns, Wheel ruts too heavy for farming carts, too wide for anything but supply wagons. He followed, the impressions with his eyes tracing the faint marks disappearing into the jungle. It wasn't a clear trail. Whoever passed through had taken care to obscure it. But it was there. Martinez crossed her arms. Looks recent. Hayes looked back at Viet Cong. She met his gaze evenly. I tell you this, and what happens to my village? That was the question, wasn't it? The military would want coordinates, maps, confirmation. They would send more men, bring fire to a place that had managed so far to avoid it. Hayes clenched his jaw. Chen spoke up, his voice quieter. We don't have to report everything. Hayes turned toward him, surprised. Chen shrugged. We saw what we saw. How we report it. That's up to us. A long silence stretched between them. Viet Cong finally nodded. Then I hope you choose wisely. From the trees, Min watched as the Americans followed the faint tracks leading away from the village. He exhaled. They were coming closer. And soon there would be no more neutral ground left. The jungle never gave up its secrets easily. Hayes moved carefully, his boots barely disturbing the thick mat of leaves beneath him. The team advanced in a staggered formation, silent, listening. The faint trail left behind by the supposed supply route was all they had to go on, and yet something didn't feel right. It was too clean, too controlled. Martinez knelt by a faint indentation in the dirt. This isn't just a path, she murmured. It's a message. Hayes studied the area. She was right. The ground was disturbed just enough, as if it had been meant to be found. Chen was crouched a few feet ahead, peering at the undergrowth. Tracks disappear up here, he whispered, but not naturally. They were covered. Intentionally. Hayes exhaled slowly. It was an old trick, one his grandfather had once shown him while tracking elk across a frozen ridge. If you want to lead a hunter, give him something to follow. If you want to lose him, make him believe he's found the truth. Min was leading them exactly where he wanted them to go. And now, Hayes had to decide if he was willing to keep playing the game. Min crouched in the dense foliage, watching the Americans as they examined the ground. They were smart. Smarter than most. Hayes had already hesitated. He was beginning to see the deception. Good. A poor opponent was an insult. But a worthy one? That was something else entirely. Tran Duc shifted beside him. They are learning, he murmured. Min nodded. But will they learn fast enough? Martinez pressed her earpiece closer. Got something, she murmured, adjusting the radio. A faint transmission, distant but decipherable, crackled through the static. She switched to Vietnamese, her voice quiet. Sounds like movement. South quadrant. Maybe a small unit. Hayes listened. Min's men were close. But why reveal themselves? Now? Martinez frowned. This isn't an accident. They want us to hear this. Hayes clenched his jaw. It was another layer to Min's game, feeding them information, just enough to make them second-guess themselves. Chen exhaled sharply. They're screwing with us. Martinez smirked. That's the general idea, yeah? Hayes looked around. The jungle was closing in, thick and humid. If Min wanted them to go south, then that meant north might hold the real answer. But before he could make the call, a burst of movement caught his eye. A shimmer in the trees. A ripple of foliage where there shouldn't have been one. Camouflage. Min's forces weren't just nearby. They were watching. A single leaf drifted down from the canopy, silent, unnoticed by all except Min. He sighed through his nose. One of his younger officers had shifted too soon. A mistake, not a fatal one yet. He turned to Bao, his young scout. Tell the men to hold position. No shots unless fired upon. Bao nodded and disappeared into the trees. Tran Duc frowned. You are letting them close in. Min nodded. Yes. Why? Min let his gaze drift back toward the Americans. Because I want to see how far they can go. Chen was the first to spot the inconsistency. There, he whispered, pointing to a cluster of thick vines wrapped around a tree trunk. It's wrong. Hayes saw it now. The vines were too perfect. They had been placed. A break in the natural pattern. A blind. Someone's behind it, Hayes murmured. Martinez tensed. Orders? Hayes considered it. Min's men were right there, close enough that one wrong step could set everything off. He had two options: engage, or keep playing the game. He looked toward the north. Let's see what he's hiding, Hayes muttered. They moved quickly, shifting course, slipping deeper into the jungle. Min's deception had led them here. Now, Hayes was about to find out why. From the trees, Min watched as the Americans changed direction. Hayes had made the right choice. Min allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. The jungle was alive with silence, the kind that only came before violence. Hayes could feel it pressing against his skin, thick as the humidity. The team had shifted north, moving parallel to the false trails Min had laid out, hoping to uncover what the guerrilla leader was hiding. But Min wasn't the kind of man to let an opponent move unchecked. They were being funneled. Hayes had seen this kind of strategy before, pushing an enemy toward a predetermined kill zone, using terrain to strip them of their advantages. He just hadn't figured out where Min wanted them to go. Not yet. Hold here, Hayes whispered, raising a fist. His team froze. Martinez crouched behind a broad tree trunk, scanning the dense foliage ahead. Chen swallowed hard but kept his rifle steady. Then, the jungle exhaled. A gunshot split the air. Hayes barely had time to shout before the world erupted into chaos. Min watched from the ridge as his men engaged. He had positioned them carefully. High ground, cover, escape routes. The Americans had been forced into a natural choke point between the rocky outcrops and thick vegetation. A single burst of automatic fire rang out. Min clenched his jaw. Too soon. One of his younger officers had panicked. Hayes's team reacted instantly, peeling off into cover. Smoke curled from the treetops as Martinez returned fire, suppressing Min's forward scouts. Min grabbed his radio, pull back, make them chase, but it was already too late. Chen tripped over a root, landing hard as bullets chewed into the trees around him. "Chen, move!" Martinez yelled, but he was frozen. The gunfire, the shouting, it was too much. His hands trembled as he tried to reload. His mind screamed at him to do something, but his body wouldn't listen. A shadow loomed in the underbrush. An enemy soldier, rifle raised. Chen's breath hitched. A gunshot cracked. The soldier crumpled. Hayes was suddenly there, grabbing Chen by the collar and yanking him back behind cover. "You good?" he barked. Chen's hands were shaking. Hayes didn't wait for an answer. He turned, firing two quick shots that sent another attacker diving for cover. "You good?" Hayes demanded again. Chen forced a nod. Then fight. Min's forces began to retreat in a controlled withdrawal. The Americans had fought back harder than expected, moving with precision despite the ambush. Then the first scream. Min turned just in time to see one of his men collapse, clutching his stomach. A clean shot. Min's breath came slow and steady, but inside, something twisted. He had known this moment would come, had prepared for it, but that didn't make it any easier. Tran Duc appeared at his side, eyes cold. "We pull out." Min hesitated. The Americans were advancing cautiously, clearing corners, moving like predators who had been startled but not beaten. This wasn't just a battle anymore. It was a contest, and Min had just lost the first piece. He nodded. "Fall back." The gunfire died slowly like the last embers of a dying fire. The jungle fell into an uneasy stillness. Martinez took stock of their team. No fatalities. Some scrapes, a bullet graze on Hayes's shoulder, but they were still breathing. Hayes knelt beside one of the fallen enemy soldiers, staring down at the man who had, minutes ago, been trying to kill him. Young, maybe 19. Martinez placed a hand on Hayes's shoulder. "They pulled out fast," she murmured. Hayes nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He looked at the boy's hands, dirt-streaked, calloused. A soldier, but not by choice. Min's men were disciplined, precise, but they weren't invincible. And now, for the first time, they had shed blood. Lei Hong heard the distant gunfire long before the wounded arrived. She set down her mortar and pestle, wiped her hands on a cloth, and rose as the first man stumbled through the doorway of her hut. He was one of Min's men, pale and sweating, gripping his side where blood seeped through his uniform. A minute later, another figure approached from the other side of the village. An American, Chen. His face was unreadable as he held out a medical kit. I don't think he'll make it without help. Lei Hong looked at him for a long moment. Then, without a word, she knelt beside the wounded man and began to work. Min and Hayes sat in separate corners of the jungle miles apart, both staring into the firelight. Both knew the game had changed. Neither knew what it would cost them next. Lei Hong worked quickly, her hands steady despite the dim candlelight, flickering in the corner of the hut. She had seen wounds like these before, bullet-torn flesh, bodies broken by war, men caught between duty and mortality. The jungle had always been a battlefield long before the Americans arrived. The young soldier on her mat trembled, sweat pooling at his temples. One of Min's scouts, too young to be carrying a rifle, too young to be dying in the mud. The bullet had torn through his shoulder, clean but deep. If the infection set in, there would be no saving him. She crushed herbs in her stone mortar, grinding them into a fine paste, the scent of earth and root rising to mix with the blood in the air. She had spent her life treating men like this. Boys who thought themselves warriors. Men who wished they were still boys. "Drink," she ordered, pressing a cup of bitter liquid to the scout's lips. He swallowed weakly, eyes fluttering before slipping into uneasy sleep. Footsteps approached the door. A pause. Then the quiet shift of weight. Someone hesitating outside. Not Min's men. Americans. Lei Hong exhaled. War was a disease, and she was trapped between its two fevers. Hayes stepped through the doorway, ducking his head slightly as his eyes adjusted to the dim interior. The air inside smelled of burning herbs and damp wood. The hut was small, but everything had its place. Bandages neatly folded, jars of medicine stacked carefully, a low fire glowing in the hearth. Lei Hong did not look up as she rinsed her hands in a wooden bowl. "You shouldn't be here." Hayes ignored her. His shoulder ached, the wound from the earlier firefight hot and angry. The field dressing Martinez had applied wasn't enough. He needed something stronger. "I heard you treat anyone," he said, voice low. Lei Hong finally met his gaze. Her expression did not change. "I do." Hayes exhaled. "Then help me." She gestured to a woven mat. "Sit." As she worked, her fingers moving deftly over his wound, Hayes watched the young scout on the opposite mat. The boy's breathing was shallow, his face pale. Hayes's jaw tightened. "Yours?" Lei Hong didn't pause. "No one is mine. He was in the firefight." She pressed a clean cloth against his wound, hard enough to make Hayes inhale sharply. "And now he is here." There was no accusation in her voice, no anger, just fact. Hayes exhaled through his nose, letting the pain ground him. "I don't want to be your enemy." Lei Hong looked at him then, truly looked at him, then stopped acting like one. Outside, hidden in the trees, Min crouched beside Tranduk. They had arrived moments after Hayes. They had watched as the American entered the hut. Now, Min listened to the low murmur of voices within. He should have been furious. Should have been thinking about how to use this moment to strike. Instead, he was watching Lei Hong through the window, the way she moved between patients, the way she did not hesitate to treat the enemy as she would treat her own. Tranduk shifted. Beside him, "We should leave." Min exhaled. Not yet. Why? Because he wanted to see what kind of man Hayes was. Because part of him, some buried, quiet part, wanted to believe that this war was not only about killing. Because long ago, before the Americans, before the bombs, before all of this, he had been a healer too. Chen stood outside, hands gripping his rifle. The weight of the jungle pressed against him. The reality of the war, the lines they had drawn, the sides they had chosen, everything was blurring. Inside that hut, Min's men bled. Inside that hut, Hayes sat beside them. And outside, just beyond the tree line, something unseen watched them all. A war with no true victors. And a healer caught in the middle. The entrance was barely a slit in the earth, hidden beneath a tangle of roots and dense undergrowth. Hayes crouched beside it, running his fingers along the packed soil. It wasn't natural. Martinez stood behind him, adjusting the strap of her radio. Looks like someone tried to cover it up. Chen knelt beside Hayes, his breath shallow. Or it's a trap. Hayes exhaled. Could be, but he had seen something like this before. Dugout positions, reinforced tunnels, subterranean lifelines built to move men and weapons beneath the war raging above. Min had spent years mastering this jungle. It made sense he'd have an escape route beneath it too. He pressed his palm against the damp soil. The air coming from the hole was cool, stale. Min's down there, Hayes murmured. Or something worth protecting. Martinez shifted uncomfortably. Underground? You sure we want to do this? Hayes glanced up at her, noting the tightness around her eyes. Claustrophobia. He had seen it in men before, the way the walls could start pressing in before you even stepped inside. Need you topside, Hayes said, giving her an out. Keep comms up. Martinez hesitated, then shook her head. No, I'm going. Hayes nodded. He wouldn't argue. Not now. He turned back to the tunnel. Chen, you're on point. Chen swallowed hard. Because I'm the smallest? Because you're the smartest. The kid managed a weak smile before clicking on his flashlight and slipping inside. Min moved silently through the tunnels, his fingers trailing along the rough earthen walls. He knew these paths like the lines of his own palm. For years they had been his people's veins running beneath the surface, unseen but essential. The Americans thought war was fought in the jungle, but the jungle was only a mask. The real war had always been here. Beside him, Tran Duc moved, with careful precision. His old fingers traced the support beams. This tunnel is aging. Min nodded, but still strong. Tran Duc frowned. For now. Min understood the warning. These tunnels had served them well, but time and war eroded everything. If the Americans ever truly discovered their full extent, they would collapse them all. A distant noise made him pause. Footsteps, not his own. Min flicked his hand, and his men melted into the shadows. He pressed himself against the cool earth, listening. The Americans had come below. The game had followed him underground. Hayes moved carefully, his breath steady, his rifle held close. The tunnel was tight, just high enough to crouch, and the deeper they went, the heavier the air became. Chen was ahead, his flashlight sweeping over the walls. This isn't random, he murmured. This is designed. Martinez exhaled sharply behind them. Feels like a damn coffin. Stay with it, Hayes murmured. Chen stopped suddenly, his light catching something metallic. A crate, half buried in the dirt. Hayes knelt, brushing away the soil. The markings were faded but recognizable. Soviet. Bingo, Martinez whispered. Supply cache. Chen pried the crate open, revealing neatly packed ammunition, medical kits, rations, enough to supply a small force for weeks. Hayes nodded. Min's lifeline. But if Min had these tunnels, he had more. And that meant this wasn't just a hiding place. It was a network. A movement ahead. Just the slightest shift of shadow. Hayes stiffened. He wasn't the only one down here. Min watched from the darkness. Hayes had found the cache, but he hadn't found the trap. Not yet. Min exhaled slowly, watching the way the American moved, the way he studied the ground, the way he hesitated when something felt off. He was good, but was he good enough? Min made his decision. He stepped back into the tunnel's darkness, pressing his fingers against the support beam beside him. And then, with a single calculated push, the tunnel began to collapse. The roar of earth giving way was deafening. Dust and soil exploded around Hayes as the tunnel shuddered, the walls groaning as they buckled inward. "Move!" he shouted. Chen barely had time to scramble before the floor tilted beneath them, sending him sliding down a sudden incline as debris rained from above. Martinez gasped, her hands clawing at the tunnel walls, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gulps. Hayes grabbed her, pulling her forward as the space behind them caved in. Then, just as suddenly, the world stilled. A thick cloud of dust hung in the air. The tunnel was split. Hayes turned, coughing. "Chen?" No response. Hayes' stomach dropped. Chen was gone. On the other side of the collapse, Min knelt, brushing dust from his face. His men had scattered through the side tunnels, avoiding the worst of the cave-in. But something was wrong. A figure coughed in the darkness. A small, thin silhouette. Not one of Min's men. One of Hayes. Min sighed. For the first time, in this war, an American had fallen into his hands, and the game was no longer being played on equal ground. The weight of the collapse pressed against the air, thick with dust and silence. Hayes shifted against the debris, coughing out the dirt in his lungs. The tunnel was gone. Martinez and Chen, gone. His world was reduced to the narrow, suffocating passage ahead. He checked his rifle, flicked on his flashlight. The beam cut through the dust, illuminating the uneven walls. He had no choice but to move forward, alone. Chen's ears were still ringing as he tried to push himself upright. His hands slipped on damp rock, his body screaming in protest. Martinez groaned beside him, clutching her side. "You alive?" she rasped. Chen swallowed. Yeah. His flashlight was gone. The darkness pressed against them, thick and absolute. He forced himself to focus, to think. This wasn't just some cave-in, this was planned. Min did this on purpose. "We need to move," he whispered, "before they find us." Martinez nodded, wincing as she struggled to her feet. She was hurt, but she wasn't stopping. Chen exhaled. He had always been the one following orders, looking to others for direction. But now Martinez needed him, and he wasn't about to let her down. Min crouched at the edge of the collapsed passage, his men gathering in tense clusters behind him. The destruction had sealed off their main route, but the Americans were still inside. The game had changed. Tran Duke approached, brushing dirt from his uniform. "Some of our men are cut off," he murmured. "We are not the only ones separated." Min nodded. "That makes us equal." But was that true? Min had the tunnels, the knowledge of their paths. The Americans were in his world now, yet he could not ignore the unease that settled in his chest. Hayes had adapted before. He would again. Min turned to Bao, his young scout. "Find them. Quickly." Hayes moved through the tunnel, every step cautious. His flashlight caught the glint of something metallic, a discarded tool, rusted from years underground. Someone had dug this long before the war. He touched the tunnel wall, fingers running over smooth reinforcements. This wasn't just an escape route. It was a fortress. A noise made him freeze. Footsteps. Close. He flicked off his light, pressing himself against the wall, listening. A figure passed just inches from him, moving with careful, practiced steps. Min. Hayes held his breath. He couldn't see him, couldn't be sure, but the way the man moved, deliberate, measured, it had to be him. Neither spoke. Neither attacked. For the first time, predator and prey shared the same space, unseen yet entirely aware of each other. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, Min vanished into the darkness. Hayes exhaled, muscles still tight. The game wasn't over. Lei Hong sighed as she pressed a damp cloth against the wounded soldier's forehead. He shivered under, her touch fevered but breathing. 2 cots away, another man groaned. An American. She glanced between them. 2 soldiers, 2 uniforms, 2 sides of the same war. And here, in this place, it didn't matter. The door creaked. She turned, expecting another wounded man. Instead, she found herself staring at a boy. Bao. The young scout hesitated, his wide eyes flicking toward the unconscious American. He is the enemy, Bao whispered. Lei Hong wiped her hands clean. No. He is a patient. Bao swallowed. Commander Min would not. I am not Min, she said simply. The boy's lips pressed into a thin line. Then, he slipped away, vanishing, back into the jungle. Lei Hong exhaled. It was only a matter of time before someone else came looking. Chen guided Martinez through the narrow passage, his fingers brushing the walls as they navigated blindly. We need light, she murmured. Chen hesitated, then pulled a small device from his vest, his emergency radio, not for communication, for power. He twisted the wires, sending a weak spark through the circuit. It wouldn't last long, but a small glow flickered to life. Martinez gave him a half-smile. Not bad, rookie. Chen exhaled. I've been paying attention. They moved forward deeper into the tunnels, the flickering light casting long shadows. Unaware that just around the bend, Min's men were waiting. Above, the jungle continued as it always had, oblivious, eternal. Below, the war was being rewritten. And in the darkness, divided yet still connected, both sides prepared for what came next. The jungle parted suddenly, revealing something out of place. Min stood at the edge of a clearing, staring at the crumbling walls of the abandoned schoolhouse. The vines had claimed it, crawling over the once bright blue paint, wrapping around the wooden beams like nature was swallowing the past. For the first time in years, Min hesitated. The last time he had stood here, the walls had been whole. The laughter of children had filled the air. Before the war, before the Americans, before everything changed. 15 years earlier. Min wiped chalk dust from his hands as he stepped outside, smiling as the students poured from the schoolhouse, their voices filling the warm afternoon air. Nguyen Van Minh, a small girl shouted, standing on her tiptoes. You forgot our lesson. Min crouched to her level, feigning surprise. I did. Then you must remind me. The girl giggled. You said the world is a book, and every person is a page. Min nodded. Pleased. That's right. And what does that mean? She scrunched her nose, thinking hard. That if we don't read all the pages, we don't understand the story? Min chuckled. Very good. The bell rang, and the students scattered, running down the dirt path toward their homes. Min watched them go, a deep sense of peace settling in his chest. But that peace did not last. A shadow passed over him, a distant droning hum. The first American aircraft. Min didn't know it then, but the war had already found them. Hayes crouched beside a rusted filing cabinet, his flashlight casting a weak glow over the scattered papers. The schoolhouse had been abandoned for years, but traces of life still clung to it. A half-broken chalkboard, wooden desks coated in dust, a child's drawing pinned to the wall, faded but intact. Martinez rifled through the documents, her movements careful. This was a real school, she murmured. Not a front. These kids lived here. Hayes nodded, barely listening. He had found something. A photograph. It was old, the edges curled with time. A group of students stood in neat rows, their expressions a mixture of joy and seriousness. And standing among them, younger but unmistakable, Min. Hayes turned, the photo over. A date was scribbled in careful handwriting. 1959, before the war had made them enemies. He exhaled, feeling something shift in his chest. Min had not always been a soldier. Min stepped into the schoolhouse, running his fingers along the doorframe. The ghosts were still here, lingering in the dust, in the broken windows, in the empty desks. He moved to the front of the room where the blackboard had once stood. The last lesson he had ever written was still faintly visible beneath the grime. History is not written by those who win, but by those who survive. A voice behind him broke the silence. You used to teach here. Min turned. Tran Duc stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. Min did not answer. Tran Duc sighed. They say, War makes us forget who we were. I don't believe that. I think it only buries it. Min clenched his jaw. Buried things stay buried for a reason. Tran Duc's gaze flicked over the schoolhouse. Does it? Lei Ti Hong dipped a cloth into warm water, her hands steady as she cleaned the American soldier's wound. Chen winced but didn't pull away. You knew Min before the war? Lei Ti Hong's lips pressed together. Yes. What was he like? She didn't answer immediately. She glanced toward the schoolhouse in the distance, barely visible through the jungle. He wanted to change the world, she murmured. Chen frowned. And now? Lei Ti Hong met his gaze. Now he is trying to survive it. Hayes ran a hand through his hair, staring at the photograph again. Min wasn't just a name on a mission report anymore. He was real. Martinez held up a stack of documents. I think Min was keeping records of the war's early days. Hayes exhaled. Why? She shrugged. Maybe because he still wanted to understand the story. Hayes studied the schoolhouse one last time, then slipped the photograph into his pocket. The mission had changed, and he wasn't sure what that meant anymore. In the fading light, Min ran a hand over the old chalkboard, the words barely visible beneath years of dust and war. History is not written by those who win, but by those who survive. He wasn't sure which one he was anymore, and for the first time, he wondered if Hayes was asking himself the same question. The jungle thinned as the ground rose beneath their boots, shifting from dense foliage to the jagged rocky slopes of the mountain range. The air was different here, thinner, drier, carrying the crisp bite of elevation. The humidity of the lowlands faded, replaced by cold gusts of wind that howled through narrow passes. Hayes adjusted the strap of his pack and looked up at the winding cliffs ahead. This terrain's a nightmare, Martinez muttered. We're exposed, as hell. Not if we move smart, Hayes replied. He had spent years climbing the peaks of Montana as a boy, learning from his grandfather how to read the land. That knowledge was coming back now. Chen wiped sweat from his forehead. How did Min's men get through here? They grew up in it, Hayes murmured. This is their advantage. And that was what worried him most. Min crouched at the edge of a high ridge, watching the Americans ascend from below. Tran Duc knelt beside him, scanning the valley through his field glasses. They move well, he admitted. Not like regular infantry. Min nodded. Hayes understood terrain. He could see it in the way he picked his routes, how he avoided unstable rock, how he moved with caution where others would rush. That made him dangerous. Min turned to Bao, the young scout at his side. Tell the men to prepare the lines. Bao nodded and disappeared into the rocks. Tran Duc exhaled slowly. Ambushing them here. Are you certain? Min glanced at him. You have doubts? Tran Duc studied the Americans below. Only in the cost. Min didn't answer. He had learned long ago that the cost of war was not measured in hesitation. The first attack came swiftly. Hayes saw the glint of movement a second too late. A burst of gunfire erupted from the cliffs, sending rounds chipping against the rock face. Cover, he barked, diving behind a boulder as the team scrambled for safety. Martinez was already returning fire, her rifle steady despite the unstable footing. They've got high ground on us. Chen pressed himself against a rock, breathing hard. We can't go forward, too exposed. Hayes gritted his teeth. Min had chosen his battlefield well. They needed a way around. He scanned the cliffs, spotting a narrow ledge winding along the mountainside. Dangerous, but their only chance. Follow me, he ordered, leading them toward it. They moved fast, dodging fire, the drop below a sheer fall into the jungle. Hayes gripped the rock face, the memories of climbing Montana's peaks flooding back. Trust the stone, Tommy. Let it tell you where to go. He forced himself to breathe, guiding the team step by step, and then the earth rumbled. Min felt it before he heard it, a deep tremor beneath his feet, then a crack. The mountainside groaned as a section of the ridge collapsed, sending a torrent of rock and debris cascading downward. Min's eyes widened. Hayes's men were directly in its path. "Landslide!" Martinez shouted. The sound was deafening. The world became a blur of dust and chaos. Hayes barely had time to react before the rocks slammed into them. He was thrown sideways, his fingers clawing for purchase as the ground vanished beneath him. A sharp snap. Then, nothing. Min gritted his teeth as he pulled himself up from the rubble. Dust choked the air, turning everything into a ghostly gray haze. He coughed, scanning the area. His men were scattered, some buried, some dazed but alive. Then he saw movement, a figure struggling against the debris. Hayes. Min's grip tightened on his rifle. The American was vulnerable, trapped beneath a slab of stone, his breath ragged. Min stepped forward. Hayes looked up, eyes sharp despite the pain. For the first time they were face to face. Neither spoke. The mountain had chosen, and it had chosen neither side. In the silence that followed, only one truth remained: survival. The mountain had buried them all equally. Hayes grimaced as he pressed against the slab of rock pinning his leg, his muscles screaming with effort. Dust clung to his skin, filling his lungs with every breath. The landslide had reshaped the battlefield, not with bullets, but with chaos. And standing just a few feet away, rifle in hand, was Min. For a long moment neither moved. Hayes could see the calculus in Min's eyes, the cold assessment of the situation. If their roles had been reversed, Hayes would have been doing the same, measuring the risk, the opportunity, the cost. Then, slowly, Min slung his rifle over his shoulder and stepped forward. Hayes tensed, but Min only crouched beside the boulder, pressing his hands against its edge. Together, without a word, they heaved. The rock shifted just enough for Hayes to drag himself free, pain shooting through his leg. Min stood and turned, scanning the wreckage around them. Hayes exhaled sharply. Didn't expect that. Min didn't. Look at him. Neither did I. Further down the slope, Martinez groaned as she pushed herself up, shaking the dust from her hair. Chen stumbled beside her, wincing as he rolled his shoulder. "I thought we were dead." "Not yet," Martinez muttered. Then she saw them. Min's men just meters away, digging frantically through the rubble. Her grip tightened on her rifle, but no one raised their weapons. Instead, her eyes locked onto Tran Duc, who was pulling a wounded man from the debris. They held each other's gaze for a long moment. Then, without speaking, they both turned back to their tasks. Survival came first. The war could wait. Viet Cong moved swiftly through the village at the base of the mountain, her hands never still. "Get them inside," she ordered, pointing to the wounded being carried in on makeshift stretchers. "Clean water. We need more cloth for bandages." A woman approached, her face etched with worry. "What about the soldiers?" Viet Cong wiped sweat from her brow. "All of them," she said. "Bring them all." Her words did not differentiate between uniform colors. War made distinctions. She did not. Min found himself working beside Hayes, clearing. Debris, moving stones, pulling the injured from the wreckage. No one spoke of it. No one acknowledged it. They simply worked. Min's hands were raw, his muscles aching. He watched as Hayes lifted a fallen branch off a wounded American soldier, saw the way his face tensed with effort. It was the first time Min had seen the man up close, not as a shadow in the jungle, not through the sights of a rifle, just a man. And Hayes was looking at him the same way. Chen scrambled toward a partially buried figure, heart hammering. He recognized the uniform. Min's men. He hesitated. Then, without thinking, he dropped to his knees and started digging. The soldier gasped as the weight was lifted from his chest, his dark eyes locking onto Chen's. For a moment there was only silence. Then the soldier nodded. Just once. Chen nodded back, and the war blurred, just a little more. By nightfall, the wounded had been carried down the mountain. The dead had been left behind. Min stood at the edge of the ridge, watching the lanterns flickering in the village below. Hayes stood a few feet away, mirroring his stance. Neither spoke of the fight that would resume when morning came. Neither spoke of what this day had, revealed. Instead, they stood in silence, looking out over the land that had nearly buried them both. The war wasn't over, but for now, just for a moment, it had paused. The mountain was behind them, but the weight of what had happened still lingered. Hayes sat on the edge of a fallen log, staring at the fading glow of his cigarette. The camp was quiet, too quiet. The usual tension of being behind enemy lines had shifted into something else, something unspoken. Martinez sat across from him, arms crossed, her face unreadable. "We gonna talk about it?" Hayes exhaled, smoke curling into the night air. "Talk about what?" She scoffed. "Come on, Cap. That wasn't just survival back there. That was something else." Hayes didn't answer. He had felt it too. The weight of Min's stare. The silence between them that spoke louder than any gunshot. "We helped them," Chen said from the side, his voice quieter. "And they helped us." "Because we had to," Martinez countered. Chen shook his head. "Did we?" That was the real question, wasn't it? Hayes looked down at the radio beside him. The message from command had come through an hour ago. "Continue mission. Target enemy supply lines. No deviation." But things weren't that simple anymore. Min sat in the dim light of his command post, his fingers curled around a teacup gone cold. Tran Duc stood nearby, his expression tight. "They are asking questions." Min looked up. "Who?" "The men." Tran Duc hesitated. "They saw what happened on the mountain. They saw you working beside the Americans. And now—" Min sighed, rubbing his temples. He had known this moment would come. "They think I am weak," he said flatly. "They think you are uncertain." The word stung more than Min had expected. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling of the cave. "Are they wrong?" Tran Duc hesitated. "They follow you because they believe in this fight." Min closed his eyes. "And do I?" Leti Hong placed a steaming bowl of rice in front of the elderly farmer, her movements precise, practiced. Around her, villagers spoke in hushed voices, their words carrying the same uncertain edge as the soldiers who had passed through the day before. "The war is changing," the old man murmured. Leti Hong didn't look up. "The war never changes." The door creaked. She turned to see a figure lingering in the entryway. Chen. He looked unsure, his hands shoved into his pockets, his eyes darting around the small room. She gestured for him to sit. "I don't understand," he admitted after a long silence. Leti Hong met his gaze. "What don't you understand?" Chen exhaled. "All of it." She smiled faintly. "Then you are starting to learn." Hayes sat alone, staring at the radio. The message from command still echoed in his head. His team was waiting for orders. His mission was clear, but the war wasn't. He clenched his fists. Tomorrow they would have to choose. Deep in the jungle, Min stood at the edge of his camp, watching the moonlight filter through the trees. Tran Duc's words still weighed on him, but so did Hayes's silence. Tomorrow they would meet again, and Min wasn't sure if they would be enemies or something else entirely. Leti Hong moved like water through the village, shifting between patience, mixing herbs, wrapping bandages with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime tending to wounds. Blood had no allegiance. It flowed the same from American flesh as it did from Viet Cong bodies. The war did not ask who deserved to live, and neither did she. A young woman stepped into the hut, her hands clutched around a folded piece of cloth. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the wounded soldier in the corner, one of Min's men, barely conscious. Leti Hong wiped her hands on a rag and turned to her. "You have something for me?" The girl nodded and passed the cloth to her. Leti Hong unfolded it carefully. Inside, written in hurried strokes, was a message. "They are coming." Hayes knelt, beside a supply cache tucked in the underbrush, his fingers running over the crate's markings. Not Viet Cong, not Soviet, local. It wasn't just Min's forces keeping this war running. There was an entire network hidden beneath the surface. Farmers, merchants, couriers, civilians who didn't wear uniforms but knew exactly where the supply lines were. Hayes exhaled. This war wasn't just about soldiers, it never had been. Martinez crouched beside him. These supplies, this is organized, coordinated. Civilians are more involved than we thought, Hayes murmured. Or more trapped, Martinez countered. Hayes didn't reply. His radio crackled. Got something? Chen's voice whispered through the static. Not over comms. You need to see this. Min sat in the dim firelight, the message in his hands. They are coming. He knew what it meant before Tran Duc even spoke. The Americans are moving, Tran Duc murmured. Not just reconnaissance, a full offensive. Min stared at the words, his grip tightening on the paper. He had expected it, had felt it coming, but seeing it confirmed in ink made it real. Bao shifted beside him, his youthful face tight with worry. What do we do? Min exhaled slowly. We prepare. But deep inside, something twisted. If the Americans were coming in force, it meant Hayes had his orders, and that meant there was no more room for hesitation. Thuti Hong ground dried roots into powder, her motions slow, deliberate. You received a message, she said without looking up. Chen shifted uncomfortably. How did you? She met his gaze. Because I received them too. Chen hesitated, then placed the folded note on the table. She picked it up, reading the words. Her expression didn't change, but something in her shoulders tensed. This war is moving faster than you realize, she murmured. Chen exhaled. Then tell me how to slow it down. Lei Hong looked at him for a long time. Then quietly, she placed the message into the burning lantern beside her. The paper curled, blackening to ash. I just did. Hayes stood at the edge of the village, staring into the jungle. Martinez stepped beside him. What's the call? Hayes didn't answer immediately. His fingers traced the worn photograph in his pocket, the one of Min before the war, surrounded by children who had once called him teacher. This war had never been simple, but now it was impossible. Hayes exhaled. We move. Martinez nodded. And if Min's there? Hayes clenched his jaw. Then I'll find out which one of us hesitates first. The order came through at dawn. Hayes listened as the radio crackled, his fingers tightening around the receiver. The voice, on the other end, was calm, measured, the kind of voice that had never set foot in this jungle, never felt the weight of mud and blood on its skin. Proceed with Operation Firebrand. Objective: cut off supply routes by any means necessary. Civilian cooperation deemed secondary to mission success. Hayes clenched his jaw. Repeat, sir, he said, though he had heard it perfectly. Full engagement, authorized. No restrictions. The words sat heavy in his chest. This wasn't reconnaissance anymore. This was escalation. Martinez stood beside him, her arms crossed. They want us to burn everything down. Hayes exhaled. Yeah. And we're not. Gonna do that, are we? He didn't answer, because he knew the moment he spoke it out loud, he would be making a choice that couldn't be undone. Min sat in silence as Tran Duc finished reading the latest report. The Americans are moving in force, Tran Duc said. They will not discriminate, this time. Min stared at the dirt floor, his thoughts distant. And our response? The men want action, Tran Duc continued. They want to set an example, detonate the bridges, cut the roads, force them to pay for every step they take. Min exhaled through his nose. And the villages in the crossfire? Tran Duc hesitated. Min looked up. You have doubts? Tran Duc sighed. I have seen many wars. None of them ended because men fought harder. Min nodded slowly. But if we do nothing, they will call you weak. Min's fingers curled into a fist. That word again. Weak. He was tired of it, tired of choosing between survival and conscience, tired of pretending they were separate things. Hayes stared at the map, his mind racing. They had 3 days before the main assault hit Min's supply routes, 3 days before the airstrikes, the artillery, the sweep and destroy operations flattened everything in their path, including civilians. Martinez leaned in. "Tell me we're not doing this." Hayes exhaled sharply. "We have our orders." Martinez's eyes darkened. "And?" He looked up at her. She was testing him now. "Prove you're the man I think you are." Chen sat quietly in the corner, his hands fidgeting. "There are people in those villages," he murmured, "not just fighters." Hayes rubbed his face. He had spent his entire career balancing orders against instinct. But this wasn't war. This was a crime waiting to happen. Min stood at the edge of the river, watching the sun rise. He had made his decision. "Tell the men," he said. "No civilian casualties. If they refuse to leave, we escort them out. No exceptions." Tran Duc stared at him. "They will call it weakness." Min turned, then let them. The night before the operation, Hayes sat alone, his rifle across his lap. Martinez approached, her voice quiet. "What's the plan, Cap?" Hayes looked up at her, then at the map. He exhaled. "We go off book. The jungle would decide the rest, and in the morning they would find out what kind of men they truly were." The jungle pulsed with an eerie stillness. A storm gathered at the horizon, its dark clouds rolling in like a slow, deliberate force. Much like the two men who moved toward each other, each leading a force bound for the inevitable. Hayes crouched beside Martinez as they examined the latest reconnaissance sketches. The full picture was finally coming into focus: supply lines, fallback routes, key encampments. Min's network wasn't just a series of outposts. It was a living, breathing system, adapting with every move the Americans made. Martinez traced a path with her finger. "He knows we're coming." Hayes nodded. "And he's already adjusted." Chen stood nearby, eyes sharp as he studied the map. He wasn't the same soldier who had hesitated weeks ago. The fear had been tempered, replaced by calculation. "What if we adjust first?" Chen asked. Hayes looked at him. The rookie wasn't a rookie anymore. He turned back to the map. They weren't just going into Min's trap. They were setting their own. Min stood at the edge of a ridgeline, watching the mist settle over the valley. The Americans were close, he could feel it. Tran Duc approached, his face lined with concern. "They know, don't they?" Min nodded. Tran Duc exhaled. "Then what do we do?" Min studied the terrain below, seeing not just jungle and rock, but the paths, the movements, the invisible game unfolding between him and Hayes. He allowed himself a small smile. "We adapt." Lei Hong wrapped a thin shawl around her shoulders as she watched the storm gather. 2 soldiers, one American, one Viet Cong, lay on woven mats, their wounds bandaged, both unconscious. She had saved them both, and soon both would return to war. Bao Min's young scout stood at the doorway. "You should leave," he said. Lei Hong looked at him. "And where should I go?" Bao swallowed, unable to answer. She sighed, kneeling beside the wounded men. "This war does not belong to warriors alone. It belongs to the land, to the people caught between. And when the storm comes, it will take us all." Bao hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he nodded. The jungle swallowed both forces as they moved, each adjusting course, each sensing the other's presence. Hayes led his team forward, silent and focused. Min's tactics had forced them to evolve, but now Hayes had begun thinking like him, anticipating the deception before it happened. Miles away, Min moved with the same precision, aware that Hayes was doing the same. Neither could stop. Neither would turn away. The storm rolled in. The final confrontation was coming, and neither man knew who would walk away from it. The first gunshot cracked through the dense jungle air. Then the storm truly broke. The mountainside exploded with movement. rifle fire snapping between the trees, bursts of smoke and dirt rising. From grenade impacts, voices barking orders in English and Vietnamese alike. The jungle, once a sanctuary for silence and patience, was now a cacophony of war. Hayes pressed his back against a tree, his rifle firm in his grip as he scanned the battlefield. This wasn't chaos. It was precision, both sides maneuvering, adjusting, adapting. Minh was playing the board masterfully, using the terrain to funnel Hayes's team into limited cover while keeping his own men moving. But Hayes had learned. He wasn't being hunted anymore. He was moving with the same calculated efficiency, anticipating Minh's shifts, countering them with his own. Martinez. Chen. Left flank. Keep them from circling. He shouted over the gunfire. Martinez barely hesitated. On it. She and Chen disappeared into the undergrowth, suppressing fire echoing behind them. A mortar round exploded nearby, sending a rain of dirt over Hayes's position. He barely flinched. They were locked, in the kind of battle that only happened between equals. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to win. Minh moved like a shadow through the trees, his rifle shifting between firing and signaling. His men were disciplined, executing every maneuver with the precision he had drilled into them. But so were the Americans. For every move he made, Hayes countered. For every trap he set, Hayes avoided or used it against him. It wasn't frustrating. It was exhilarating. Tran Duc crouched beside him, reloading his rifle. They are pushing back harder than expected. Minh nodded. Because we taught them how. Tran Duc exhaled, then his gaze hardened. The village is in the crossfire. Minh hesitated. He had known it would come to this. The civilians had been given time to leave, but not all of them would have. Lê Thị Hong's warning echoed in his mind. This war does not belong to warriors alone. He cursed under his breath. Signal a shift. Keep fire away from the lower valley. Tran Duc gave him a look. And if it weakens our position? Minh met his gaze. Then we find another way. Lê Thị Hong moved swiftly through the village, ushering people toward the tree line, her voice firm but calm. Move quickly. Stay low. Follow. The path to the caves. A woman clutched her child to her chest. But the soldiers, Lê Thị Hong didn't stop. They will not stop for us. A bullet snapped through the air overhead, striking the wooden post of a house. She didn't flinch. War had come to her doorstep again, and she would not let it take more than it already had. Hayes saw the shift before his radio even crackled. Minh's men were pulling back from the lower sector, deliberately steering combat away from the village. It wasn't a retreat. It was a choice, a moral one. Hayes made his own choice. Hold fire on anything near civilian zones, he ordered. Keep pressure on their fallback points instead. Martinez's voice crackled through the radio. That's not what command wanted. Hayes fired a burst and ducked behind cover. I don't care. Tran Duc had been with Minh since the beginning. He had seen war, seen men change, seen others break. But this war had gone on too long, and as he watched Minh hold his fire for the sake of people who would never know his name, he made a decision of his own. The radio on his belt crackled. A voice. One of Minh's forward scouts. Enemy forces moving up the east ridge. New element, unknown. Tran Duc stiffened. Minh frowned. Unknown? Then, a sound neither side expected. The distant whump of helicopters. Not American, not Vietnamese. Someone else was coming. Hayes heard it too. He looked up past the smoke and gunfire toward the low thudding in the sky. Reinforcements? No. He knew every unit in the area. This was something else. And suddenly, the battle between him and Minh didn't seem as important. Because now, neither of them knew who the real enemy was. Minh turned to Tran Duc, but before he could issue an order, gunfire erupted from the eastern ridge. Rapid, calculated, and without hesitation. Not Minh's men, not Hayes's. A third force had entered the battlefield. And just like that, the game had changed. The air inside Lê Thị Hong's healing house was thick with the scent of herbs and slow-burning incense. Outside, the jungle still whispered of war. the distant crack of gunfire, the occasional echo of an explosion far beyond the valley. But here, within these walls, there was only silence. Hayes stepped inside first, his rifle slung across his back, his body aching from the battle. Martinez followed, her expression unreadable. Chen hesitated at the threshold, his fingers brushing against the wooden frame before stepping inside. And then they saw him. Nguyen Van Minh, seated at the far side of the room, his rifle leaning against the wall beside him, his hands resting lightly on his knees. His uniform was dirt-streaked, a cut along his temple barely cleaned. His eyes, sharp as ever, met Hayes's, across the dimly lit space. For a long moment no one spoke. Martinez's hand twitched near her holster. Chen swallowed hard. Hayes took a breath. Then slowly he sat down across from Minh. No weapons, no orders, no battlefield between them. Minh watched him carefully, then nodded once. A small, imperceptible motion. But enough. Leti Hong emerged from the back room, her sleeves rolled, up her hands damp from tending to wounds. She barely spared them a glance as she moved to her work table. "You will not fight in my house," she said simply. Neither man moved. Neither had planned to. Minh exhaled, looking past Hayes to the wounded lying along the far side of the room. Americans, Viet Cong, side by side. Some unconscious, others awake but too tired to care who was bleeding beside them. "This is what remains of our war," Minh murmured. Hayes followed his gaze. The soldiers who had followed them, who had believed in their leadership, now lay broken, waiting to see if fate would carry them home or bury them here. Hayes rubbed his temple. "Was it ever ours?" Minh didn't answer. Martinez stood near the window, arms crossed. "I don't get it." Minh glanced at her. "What is it you do not get, Sergeant?" She gestured toward the room. "1 minute we're trying to kill each other. The next we're sitting in the same damn room." Minh gave a small smile. "Is that not war?" Hayes leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "It doesn't have to be." Minh studied him for a long moment. Then quietly, he said, "No, it does not." Leti Hong lit a single candle, placing it on the low wooden table between them. "For the dead," she said. Minh inclined his head slightly. Hayes did the same. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant murmurs of the wounded. Then finally Minh spoke. "What happens now, Captain?" Hayes didn't answer right away. He had spent weeks hunting Minh, treating him as a shadow, a target. But now, looking at him, he saw something else, a man. Not an enemy. A reflection. "I don't know," Hayes admitted. Minh gave a slow nod. "Then we will find out together." Outside, the jungle remained unchanged. The war would go on. But inside this room, for the first time, it had stopped. The jungle had swallowed battlefields before. It would do so again. Hayes stood at the edge of the clearing, watching as the first tendrils of green reclaimed the ground where men had fought, bled, and died. The heavy scent of gunpowder had faded, replaced by the thick, earthy aroma of rain-soaked soil. Minh stood beside him, silent. No longer a target. No longer an enemy. Just a man, watching the land heal. The agreement had been unspoken, but understood. Minh would withdraw his forces from the southern valley, allowing the civilians to remain, unharassed. In return, Hayes's unit would report a successful disruption of enemy supply lines, giving command what they needed to justify their departure. A lie, wrapped in truth. A way to end a war that neither of them had ever truly owned. Martinez gave Hayes a look as the team packed their gear. "You sure about this?" Hayes nodded. "Yeah." She exhaled, then gave a small, lopsided smile. "Guess we learned something out here after all." Hayes smirked. "Guess we did." Leti Hong moved through the village, ensuring every family had what they needed before the Americans left. The war had not spared them, but it had not taken them either. That was victory enough. As she wrapped fresh cloth around a woman's hand, she glanced up to see Chen standing nearby. He had changed. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by quiet, understanding. "You will leave soon," she said. Chen nodded. "Yeah." She studied him. "And what will you do with what you have learned?" He thought about it for a long moment. Then finally he said, "I won't forget." She smiled. "Then that is enough." Min's men began their own withdrawal, fading back into the jungle like whispers in the wind. The war would continue elsewhere, but not here. Not anymore. Tran Duc stood beside Min, watching as the Americans moved out. "Do you think they will keep their word?" Min considered the question. Then he looked toward Hayes. Hayes met his gaze, then gave a slow nod. Min returned it. "Yes," he said simply. Years later, the mountains had not changed. Hayes stood beneath the broad canopy, his hands resting on the wooden railing of a small schoolhouse, the same one where he had once found Min's photograph. A group of students sat before him, listening as he spoke about the war, about the choices made in the jungle, about the enemy who had not been an enemy at all. On the other side of the world, Min did the same. Time had carried them forward, but the past had never truly left them. And so, in their own ways, they passed it on, because wars ended, but the lessons remained. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.